They laughed when they saw Eli Hartwell out in her orchard at midnight, spraying water on her apple trees in the freezing cold. They said she'd lost her mind. They said she was going to kill what was left of her trees. But when the worst frost in 40 years swept through the valley and destroyed every orchard but hers, no one was laughing anymore. This is the story of a young woman who trusted a piece of forgotten wisdom that everyone else had thrown away, and how it saved not just her farm, but an entire valley. If you've ever been doubted, mocked, or told that the old way was the wrong way, this story is for you. Tap subscribe before we begin, for everyone who knows that sometimes the oldest knowledge is the most powerful of all. Now let me take you to a quiet valley of apple orchards and the spring that nearly destroyed them all. Eli Hartwell was 25 years old, and she was the last of her family still working the land. The Hartwell orchard sat on a gentle slope above the valley, rows upon rows of old apple trees that her grandfather had planted with his own hands more than 50 years before. It wasn't the biggest orchard in the valley, and it certainly wasn't the most modern. But to Eli, every tree was a part of her family. She had grown up in that orchard, following her grandfather, Samuel, down the rows as he pruned and tended and talked to the trees as if they could hear him. He taught her everything: when to prune, when to harvest, how to read the weather in the sky and the soil. And he taught her something else, too, something the other farmers had long forgotten. Her grandfather had passed away 2 winters before, and the weight of the orchard had fallen entirely on Eli's shoulders. Money was tight, the harvests had been thin, and the bigger modern orchards down in the valley looked at the old Hartwell place with a kind of pity, certain that a young woman alone could not keep such an old-fashioned operation alive for long. But Eli loved that orchard with everything she had, and she had made a promise to her grandfather that she would never let it die. The trouble began in early spring, just as the apple trees were beginning to bloom. The buds had opened into delicate pink and white blossoms, fragile and beautiful, and absolutely vital. Those blossoms were the promise of the entire year's harvest. If they survived, there would be apples. If they died, the orchard would produce nothing, and a year with no harvest could mean the end of the farm. And that spring a threat was coming that every orchard farmer feared more than anything else: a frost. The weather reports were grim. A massive cold front was sweeping down from the north, the kind of late spring freeze that came only once in a generation. Temperatures were going to plunge far below freezing for an entire night, right when the blossoms were at their most fragile. A frost like that could wipe out every blossom in the valley in a single night, and with them the entire year's harvest. Panic spread through the valley. The big modern orchards scrambled to protect their crops. They brought in expensive propane heaters, setting hundreds of them between the rows to try to keep the air warm. They ran giant wind machines to push the cold air up and away. They spent fortunes doing everything modern farming told them to do to fight the coming freeze. Eli couldn't afford any of that. She had no money for heaters, no money for wind machines. Standing in her orchard, looking at her fragile blossoms and the falling temperature, she felt a wave of despair. Everything her grandfather had built was about to die, and she had no way to stop it. And then she remembered. She remembered a cold spring night many years before, when she was just a girl. She remembered her grandfather waking her in the middle of the night, leading her out into the orchard, and doing something that made no sense to her at all. He had turned on the sprinklers. He had sprayed water, freezing water, all over the blossoming trees on a night when the temperature was dropping well below freezing. "Grandpa," she had asked, shivering, "won't the water freeze the blossoms? Won't it make it worse?" And her grandfather had smiled, the way he always did when he was about to teach her something important. "That's what everyone thinks," he had said. "But it's the opposite. Water is strange, Eli. When water freezes, when it turns to ice, it lets go of a little bit of heat, just a little. But it's enough. As long as we keep spraying and the water keeps freezing, it holds the buds at exactly the freezing point, and the buds can survive at freezing. What they can't survive is the deep, killing cold that comes after. The ice is a blanket. It protects them from the worst of it." She hadn't fully understood it then, but she had watched that night as her grandfather coated the trees in a shell of ice. And in the morning, while frost had touched the edges of the valley, the Hartwell blossoms had survived, glittering and alive beneath their armor of ice. It was an old technique, one that orchard farmers had used for generations before the heaters and the machines came along, a technique that almost everyone had forgotten. Eli stood in her freezing orchard, the memory burning bright in her mind. And she made her decision. She would do what her grandfather had taught her. She would ice the trees. She worked through the evening, dragging out every sprinkler and hose she owned, setting them up between the rows, checking and rechecking the old irrigation lines. Her hands went numb with cold, her breath came out in clouds, and just as the temperature began its terrible plunge, as the sun went down and the deep cold rolled in, Eli turned on the water. The sprinklers hissed to life, throwing a fine mist of water over the blossoming trees, and in the freezing air the water began to freeze. It was around this time that her neighbors noticed. Down in the valley, where the big orchards were lighting their hundreds of heaters, a few farmers looked up the slope toward the Hartwell place and saw something that made no sense to them. There was Eli, out in the dark and the cold, spraying water all over her trees. "What in the world is that girl doing?" one of them said. Word spread quickly. Some of them drove up the road to see for themselves, and they stood at her fence, watching in disbelief. "Eli, what are you doing?" called out old Marcus, a respected farmer who had known her grandfather. "You're spraying water in a hard freeze? You're going to turn those trees into ice. You'll kill every blossom you've got." "It's how my grandfather did it," Eli called back, not stopping her work. "The ice protects them. It holds them right at freezing so the deep cold can't get in." The farmers shook their heads. To them, it was madness. Everyone knew that cold killed blossoms, and here was this young woman pouring water on them in the middle of a freeze. They were certain she had panicked, that grief and desperation had driven her to do something foolish. "She's going to lose that whole orchard," Marcus said sadly to the others as they walked away. "It's a shame." Samuel would have known better. They didn't realize that Samuel was exactly who had taught her. They went back to their heaters and their wind machines, certain that the modern way was the only way, and certain that the Hartwell orchard was finished. But Eli didn't stop. All through that long, brutal night, she kept the water running. She walked the rows in the dark, checking that every tree was being coated, that no sprinkler had frozen up or failed. The temperature dropped lower and lower, far below freezing, the coldest night the valley had seen in 40 years. And as it dropped, something beautiful and strange was happening in the Hartwell orchard. Each tree was slowly becoming encased in a shimmering shell of ice. The water froze layer upon layer over the blossoms, and just as her grandfather had explained, every time a new layer of water turned to ice, it released a tiny bit of heat. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Beneath their glittering armor of ice, held at exactly the freezing point, the delicate blossoms stayed alive, protected from the killing cold that gripped the rest of the valley. Down in the valley, things were going very differently. The frost was simply too deep, too severe. The propane heaters could not keep up with a cold this brutal. The wind machines were not enough. One by one, in orchard after orchard, the fragile blossoms froze solid and died, blackening in the killing cold, despite everything the farmers had spent and done. By the time the sun rose, the damage across the valley was catastrophic. Farmers walked out into their orchards in the gray morning light to find their blossoms blackened and dead. The frost had destroyed nearly everything. Years of work, an entire season's harvest, fortunes spent on heaters and machines, all of it gone in a single terrible night. There was a stunned silence over the valley as the farmers realized the scale of what they had lost. And then they looked up the slope toward the Hartwell orchard, and what they saw stopped them in their tracks. The Hartwell orchard was glowing. In the light of the rising sun, every tree was sheathed in a brilliant, glittering shell of ice, sparkling like the orchard was made of glass and diamonds. It was breathtaking. And as the morning sun warmed the air and the ice slowly began to melt and drip away, the farmers saw something that they could scarcely believe. The blossoms underneath were alive. Pink and white and perfect, the Hartwell blossoms emerged from beneath their melting armor of ice, completely unharmed. While every other orchard in the valley had been destroyed, Eli's trees had survived. Her entire harvest had been saved by the very thing they had all told her was madness. The farmers came up the slope, drawn by the impossible sight. They walked Eli's rows in stunned silence, staring at the living blossoms emerging from the melting ice, struggling to understand how the old-fashioned orchard they had pitied was now the only one left standing. Old Marcus was the first to speak. He stood before a Hartwell tree watching a perfect pink blossom emerge from the dripping ice, and he took off his hat. "I told you that you'd kill them," he said quietly. "I was wrong. I've been farming this valley for 40 years, and I forgot the one thing that would have saved us all." He looked at Eli with something close to awe. "Your grandfather knew, and he taught you." "He did," Eli said softly, resting her hand on the cold, wet bark of one of her trees. "He told me the old ways aren't always wrong. Sometimes we just forget them." That year, the Hartwell orchard was the only one in the valley to produce a harvest, and Eli did something that surprised everyone. She didn't gloat. She didn't hoard her good fortune. Instead, she gathered the farmers of the valley and taught them, exactly as her grandfather had taught her. The old technique of protecting the blossoms with ice, the wisdom that had nearly been lost forever. The next time a hard frost threatened the valley, the orchards were ready. Up and down the slopes, in the freezing dark, the farmers turned on their sprinklers and coated their trees in protective ice, just as Eli had shown them. And when the sun rose, the blossoms of the whole valley survived. The old knowledge, once nearly forgotten, had been saved, and with it, the orchards of the valley for generations to come. Eli kept her grandfather's orchard alive and thriving for the rest of her days, every tree a living memory of the man who had taught her, and she never forgot the lesson of that frozen night, that the wisdom of those who came before us is a precious thing, and that sometimes the answer we are searching for has been there all along, waiting in the past for someone willing to remember it. Her grandfather had been right. The old ways aren't always wrong. Sometimes they are the very thing that saves us. Eli Hartwell never set out to prove anyone wrong. She simply trusted the wisdom of the man who had raised her on the coldest night of her life. And because of that, an entire valley of orchards lived to bloom again.